Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Jennifer Palmer, and I am an Early Care and Education Policy Associate here at the National Conference of State Legislatures, or NCSL for short. In addition to our expert presenter, who we'll introduce in just a moment, I am joined on the webinar today by my colleague, Allison May. Before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to share a bit of background on NCSL, who we are, and why we've been filling up your inbox lately. We are a bipartisan membership organization that serves legislators and legislative staff from all states, commonwealths, and territories. As a legislator or staffer, you are automatically an NCSL member, and we are here to serve and support you. While we do not advocate for certain policies, NCSL does provide research, technical assistance, and opportunities for policymakers and staff to exchange ideas and learn from experts and one another. We are joining you today from our office in Denver, Colorado, where the policy research staff is headquartered. We also have an office in Washington, D.C., where our colleagues advocate at the federal level on behalf of states' rights and interests and keep federal policymakers informed of the innovative work you're all doing in your state. Along with our director, Donna Wilson, Allison and I make up the Early Care and Education team here at NCSL. We track legislation from across the country on child care, home visiting, pre-kindergarten, and many other related topics. We author policy briefs and newsletters on hot topics in early childhood, as well as host convenings for legislators and staff to dive deeper into early childhood policy. One of our premier programs is the Early Learning Fellows. Each summer, a group of 25 to 35 legislators and staff who have first been nominated by their legislative leadership and then made it through our application process participate in 2 in-person meetings and 2 webinars in which they expand their knowledge on early learning policy from expert researchers and from one another. In the coming year, we will welcome our 9th class of Early Learning Fellows and are hopeful that the state of Virginia will be represented. So be on the lookout for information on how you can become an Early Learning Fellow in the new year. In the meantime, you can learn more about this program and the achievements of our over 200 alumni by visiting our website and checking out our alumni report from last year. As you likely know, Allison and I had hoped to be with you in person today in Richmond for a Virginia-focused early learning legislative briefing. However, we understand that this is a very busy time of year for you all, especially following an election. So we'd just like to thank our friends at the Virginia Early Childhood Foundation with whom we partnered on the planning of that legislative briefing, and note that they are an excellent resource for all things early childhood in your state, and would encourage you to connect with them for information on the history, the current landscape, and the future of early learning in Virginia. So in lieu of an in-person convening today, we are pleased to offer you this opportunity to learn about early brain development and its effects on children's ability to learn and thrive. In just a moment, I will hand things over to our very qualified and talented presenter. I just want to point out that we hope to leave plenty of time for Q&A at the end of the presentation, so feel free to enter your questions into the text box on the bottom left-hand side of your screen. And I'll also note that today's webinar is being recorded and will be available in the coming days as an archived video. With that, I am pleased to introduce Dr. Sarah Lytle from the Institute of Learning and Brain Sciences, also known as iLabs, at the University of Washington. Dr. Lytle leads the Outreach and Education Division at iLabs and regularly presents on the latest science of child development to parents, educators, policymakers, and leaders in the early learning community. Sarah, the floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thanks, Jenny, and welcome, everyone. I'm thrilled to be here with you today, remotely, as it were. But I am from iLabs, the Institute for Learning and Brain Sciences at the University of Washington, based in Seattle. Our institute does a variety of research on child development. We study child development across all domains, primarily in the ages of 0 to 5, though we're increasingly dabbling in older ages, and we actually have a teenage brain development study that's going on right now that we're very excited about. But the core of our work really does remain in the 0 to 5 space, and really thinking about what it takes to build a human brain, and how does a child who's very dependent on other people from day one of their lives become a child who's school ready at age 5, if you zoom ahead 5 years. And so with that research across all domains, cognitive, social, emotional, brain development, of course, we also have an internal outreach and education team. And our team here at iLabs is made up of people who are trained scientists, people who understand the science but are passionate communicators of the science. And so with this sort of two-part system here at iLabs, the research and the outreach, we're really able to not only do a lot of this primary research, but then spread the word and get it out into the hands of people who can use it. People such as yourselves, people like policymakers. We do a lot of work with early learning providers and also with parents. And all of this work is really in service of creating a world in which children thrive. So that's who we are as iLabs, and that's why I'm so very excited to be here with you today. So we really want to talk today about how early experiences shape the brain, and I want to talk about the full spectrum of the 0 to 5 space and really think about how some of these things that happen in children's very earliest years and very earliest months even really affect the school-ready child that they will become at age 5. And so to start here, I want to consider what we know about children's brain development on a very fundamental level. So very fundamentally speaking, we know that children's brains are very large when they're born. In fact, children's brains are about 25% of what they will eventually be as adult size when a child is born. That's huge. If you take your adult height or weight and divide it by 4, you can imagine that would be a very big baby. But children's brains are relatively big, especially when you consider the proportion of the brain size to the rest of their body. But the other piece here is that children's brain development happens very, very quickly over those first 5 years of life. If you speed ahead 5 years to when children are entering kindergarten at age 5 or so, by the time children are hitting our formal schooling age, you already see that their brains are about 92% of what they will eventually be as adult size. That is an enormous amount of growth in those first 5 years. Now, the major caveat here, of course, is that children's brains are not 92% done, as it were. Anybody who's met a 5-year-old can tell you that there's a lot more brain development to be done, and a lot more development that needs to happen before a child is really, what you might consider to be adult-like. So the 92% really refers to size, but nevertheless, there's an enormous amount of growth in children's brains in those first 5 years. So what's happening? Well, when children are born, we know that children are born with almost all of the neurons or brain cells that they will ever have, about 86 billion of them. Now, these neurons, when they're born, are not connected to other neurons. And so that's really the work of early childhood, is to start to make these connections. It's as if children are born with those telephone poles, but not the wires that allow the signals and those communication signals to pass back and forth between them. Now, during these earliest months and years of life, we know that the work of early childhood is really building those connections. And every time a child has an experience, connections are formed. Every time a child has a repeat experience, and the more times that children have these repeated experiences over time, the stronger those connections become. And so that really then prioritizes the importance of those earliest experiences in children's lives for brain connections and building that very foundational brain architecture that's going to serve children well. So we oftentimes think about this in terms of a forest analogy, for example. So we start to think about, when a child is born, you might imagine a forest, a very young and immature forest, where you have trees that are pretty skinny. They don't really have a lot of leaves, they're not really tall. The roots are certainly not very deep and intricate, underground. But then as children grow, as children are making these connections, they're building the most complicated network known to man. And over time, that becomes like a very mature forest. So you can consider this picture on the right, where the trunks of these trees are stronger, the roots are going deeper into the ground, the branches on the trees are reaching out and overlapping and touching the branches of nearby trees. It's a lot more complex, a lot more dense. And that's exactly what happens with children's brain networks over time. You go from this relatively immature network to a much, much more mature, complex, dense network over time. And a lot of this work happens in those first 5 years. As we think about the size of brain development going from 25% in the, at birth to 92% by the time a child is age 5, you can think of this network as growing, going from that sapling forest to a very, very dense forest. But the story here is not all about growth, growth, growth. At some point, we can't just, continue growing, ad nauseum. You have to think about really strengthening also. And so when we think about what really builds a thriving brain, there's certainly that growth component, and that's what we consider this blooming period of children's brain development, where lots of new connections are being formed. But then the next step of children's brain development is something we call pruning. So children's brain networks start to take some of those connections that are not being used very frequently and starts to cut them back, reduce them, lose them, if you will. But this is a really good thing, because what the brain is doing is being very selective about the connections that it keeps. So if you had an experience one time and your brain started to make that connection, but you've never really had that experience again and it wasn't really all that impactful, your brain is probably going to prune away the connections associated with that particular experience. Now, why is this a good thing? Because it leads to this third stage of brain development, which becomes this thriving brain. So over time, the connections that are unused are pruned away, and what that does is it allows those remaining connections to get even stronger over time. And so that's when the brain thrives. So it's as if you have this growth period, the blooming period, you're starting to prune away some of those connections that are unused, and then that allows that brain to really thrive and be efficient over time, which is going to be a really important piece of this story. Now, when we think about pruning, there are certainly some people, we've heard it in our work with the community, who say, oh, I don't want my child to use it or lose it. That sounds like a very bad thing. But in fact, I think it's very important for us to remember that pruning is good. Use it or lose it is a good thing when we think about brain development, because that's what leads us to this very highly efficient brain. Now, one more note about pruning. We know that pruning happens at various stages for various kinds of skills in the brain. And in fact, if you look at it at sort of categories of skills over time, we know that the pruning happens at different periods for different kinds of skills. So in this graph, for example, you see 3 different very broad categories of skills: sensory skills, language and motor skills, and higher cognitive skills. Now, each of these skills we know peaks or has a sensitive period. Some people used to say a critical period. We're thinking more in terms of sensitive period now. A sensitive period, which is that time in development when the brain is really, really ready to learn that particular skill. And so you see that those sensory skills peak first. That's the first sensitive period that children really have in their lives. That's a time when children's eyesight is developing, their sense of hearing is developing. All of those things are really very well developed and honed much earlier than some of children's other skills. Now, because that sensitive period happens early, we also know that the pruning happens very early. So you can think of the pruning as sort of that downslope after that peak sensitive period window. Now, next in development, we oftentimes see the language and motor skills having their sensitive period and then the pruning. And so you're thinking here about a lot of those gross motor skills, fine motor skills, but then also a lot of the language skills. And we'll talk about some specific language skills later, but you start to see some of these language skills even pruned within that first year of life. So you have those periods, those windows of opportunity when children are really learning a lot about these particular skills, such that the brain then develops and really, figures out what it needs to know, which connections it needs to hold on to, and then prunes away the others. And then finally, this third peak that you see here are higher cognitive skills. Those are things like, those advanced kind of thinking skills, like the ability to plan and realize, think about the consequences for your actions. In fact, we know that humans don't don't typically show adult-like higher cognitive abilities until their mid-20s or so, which many people who have teenagers or who have lived with teenagers will recognize and start to think, maybe that might explain some things. So those higher cognitive skills really do take a longer time to develop, and therefore they have a later sensitive period, a later window of opportunity, and the pruning doesn't happen until much later in life. So different windows of opportunity, but again, this idea is that a lot of what's happening, even to support children's higher cognitive skills, really does in fact begin early. So I want to switch a little bit now and move a little bit more towards thinking about what exactly do we know about children's brain development, and what are some examples of this. I think it's, it's great to talk about neurons and sensitive periods and pruning, but what does that actually look like functionally for a child? And that's one of the things that we do a lot of here at the Institute for Learning and Brain Sciences. So one of the ways that we are able to look at children's brain development over time is through a fancy machine called magnetoencephalography. So MEG is a technology, is sort of, as you can see, looks like an old-fashioned hairdryer from Mars, in the sense that we have a dome there, and you can see that the baby's head or a child's head will fit right up into that dome there. And with this machine, the dome has 306 sensors, and we're able to see in real time where and when activity is occurring in that child's brain. And so we get an enormous amount of data, because this machine will tell us at a millisecond by millisecond level, when that activity is occurring, and we also get millimeter by millimeter accuracy in terms of the spatial origination of that brain activity. And so this machine gives us a lot of really good information about how children's brains are developing. It's really good for studying infants in particular, because it's completely noiseless and non-invasive. If anybody has ever had an MRI, that really is sort of our next best technology as far as infant brain imaging is concerned. And people, I'm sure you know that MRIs tend to be very, very noisy. It's hard to have an infant stay still for the amount of time that you need to really get some good imaging data from them. So this MEG machine, magnetoencephalography, is really a great tool for us in terms of thinking about children's brain development over time. And so I wanted to give you a couple of instances here, or at least some research data that shows exactly what kinds of things we're looking at and what it tells us about the importance of early experiences. So we brought children in at 3 ages, and we were looking in particular at children's language development and the development of the language networks in a child's brain. So we brought children in at 3 ages, at newborn age, at 6 months of age, and at 12 months of age. And we wanted to look and see what was happening in their brain as they listened to the sounds of language. And we were interested in particular in how the language perception and the language production areas of the brain coordinate and work together over time. Now, you can imagine that to become a sophisticated speaker, you have to both understand language and be able to produce language. And that's the trick that is achieved by these 2 areas of the brain. They need to be able to coordinate back and forth with each other so that you can understand what somebody is saying, formulate your own response, and speak it back to that person to really be involved in a conversation. So here's what we found. So at newborn age, when children are listening to the sounds of language, you can see here that we see a lot of activity in the language perception or the hearing area of the brain, but not a lot of activity in the language production or the speaking area of the brain. That's pretty much what we expected. And we know that the child is hearing us, hearing the sounds. That's all very good. But again, that's pretty much what we expected. If we zoom ahead to the 12-month-old results, you'll see that at 12 months of age, when children are listening to the sounds of language, syllables like ta, da, ra, la, what you see some activity in the speech perception and the speech production. So both activity in the hearing and speaking areas of the brain. Again, for us, this was pretty much expected in the sense that at 12 months of age, children are probably speaking their first word. If not, they're on the cusp of speaking their first words. But right now, they're really on the precipice of entering that conversation. They're really ready to hear what's going on. What was really interesting to us and a little bit surprising was what happened in the results from the 6-month-old brains. So when 6-month-olds are listening to the sounds of language, remember they're not doing anything, they're just listening. What we see is we do see activation, again, in both the hearing and the speaking areas of the brain. I know it's sort of faint pink there, but believe me, the activation is there and it's significant and it's really interesting. Because what does that mean? Well, consider what the average 6-month-old is doing. The average 6-month-old is not yet speaking first words. They're probably about 6 months away from that, probably not until they're about 12 months or so. So they're not yet speaking first words. Most 6-month-olds are not even babbling yet. So they really aren't even doing anything that we would, in a research setting, classify as language production. And yet, we see that when they're listening to the sounds of language, their brain is already activating that language production area. It's as if their brain is learning to coordinate and using opportunities of hearing language to do some sort of rehearsal kind of activation, such that by the time they are ready to speak their first words, they are able to really coordinate, and those brain systems have been honed over time because of these rehearsals, so that when they are 12 months and ready to enter conversation, that's exactly what they can do. Now, why do we think of this as being so important for early experiences? Well, consider when this rehearsal kind of activation is happening. It's happening as children are listening to the sounds of language. And what does that mean? That means that children absolutely need to hear language, need to be involved and embedded in a rich language environment for their brain to build the systems that are going to support language and communication later on. That's enormously important. Luckily, we don't hear this too much anymore, but there was a time when we heard parents say things like, oh, I'll talk to my child when he talks back to me. For us, this data shows that that is missing the boat. If you don't provide children with that very rich, high-quality atmosphere at a very early age, we're missing that opportunity for their brains to do all of that work under the hood before we ever see behavioral evidence of it. And I think that's critically important. So I want to give you one additional study result that really, I think, speaks to the importance of early experiences. And here we're considering the bilingual experience as one kind of early experience. So yes, this is a study on bilingualism. We're looking at Spanish-English bilinguals compared to English monolinguals. But I want to consider that the bilingual experience is a very particular kind of experience, and we can look at how that experience affects children's brain development. And so here what you can see on this graph is the strength of children's brain responses to sounds either in Spanish or in English at 11 months of age. These children are pretty young still. But even at 11 months of age, you see that the bilingual experience, those 11 months of being immersed in a bilingual environment, have allowed the Spanish-English bilinguals to show strong brain responses to both the Spanish sounds and the English sounds. In contrast, those English monolinguals have only specialized for those English sounds. You only see a strong strength of response for the English sounds, and you don't see a very strong response for the English monolinguals with the Spanish sounds. Now that's important because that means that, as much as we're talking about these language environments, even 11 months of being immersed in a language environment, before, by the way, you're really speaking your first words, really does hone the architecture of your brain and determine exactly what kinds of things your brain is paying attention to. For these monolinguals, their brain is already paying attention to both Spanish sounds and English sounds. And that's no longer the case for monolinguals because they've pruned that away. They know that they only really need to prioritize their ability to distinguish those English sounds. And so I think that's really important, and I'd like to leave with this idea that it really is that, as we're thinking about our earliest experiences, those early experiences build the foundational architecture of our brains. And I think that's sort of the fundamental point of what I want to convey today. But I think it's important to really consider how early that happens. And so we've been talking about things that happen even in that first year of life, but that's not where it ends. So, for example, if we consider, just to stick on this language theme for a moment, if we consider a variety of pieces of language development, we know that things that happen early really do have a profound effect on on children's language development later on. So, for example, if we consider gray matter, for example. So gray matter is largely made up of the neurons in your brain. Those look gray on brain scans, so they are considered gray matter. We know that the amount of gray matter a child has at 7 months of age is related to their vocabulary later on. Now, you might be thinking, well, how do you grow gray matter? Well, in fact, those high-quality early experiences are really what's going to improve the proportion of gray matter even as early as 7 months, and that's going to be related to children's vocabulary later on. We also know that when children hear infant-directed speech, that sing-song speech signal that we sometimes use when we talk to infants, the "Hello, baby, how are you today?" We know that is actually really, really good for children to hear. It's like milk to the infant brain. Infants pay attention to it. They use it to learn the language. And in fact, no surprise, hearing infant-directed speech early on in that first year of life is related to children's vocabulary later on. We also know, by the way, that hearing infant-directed speech and children's vocabulary at 2 years of age predicts reading readiness out to age 5. That's incredible. So as we're starting to think about what makes a child school ready, some of these things that we're thinking about in that first year of life are really going to affect those school readiness markers. Again, we also know that speech perception, so a child's ability to tell the difference between the rahs, the lahs, the tahs, the dahs in their particular language, is also a predictor of reading readiness at age 5. Now let's add some more pieces in here. We know that children, the more that a child hears sophisticated words, so not just your usual vocabulary, but we're going to talk about the rectangular table, for example. We're going to talk about our wishes and hopes and dreams, the things that you can't really see, those intangibles. The more children hear those sophisticated words, again, the higher their reading readiness and the greater their reading comprehension, even out to 4th grade. So for as much as we're starting to think about, some of these things that happen in those very earliest years of life, I just want you to remember and keep in mind that that doesn't stop there. These things are those foundational skills that are really going to start the ball rolling for a variety of later skills. And we're considering, just sort of a language kind of pathway here, but you could very easily and very similarly map this kind of pattern out for a variety of other skills and other domains for children. And so, again, just to remember that those things that we're talking about in those early years, we're thinking of them as very foundational skills that allow children's additional quality experiences, high-quality experiences, to build on those and really create a child that's school-ready later on. Okay. Now, I want to think about what that means for children in everyday settings, for example. So the UNICEF and the World Bank and the World Health Organization have put out this chart that I really like, and I think it's good for us to think about and keep in mind as we think about the components of nurturing care. And so for UNICEF, the World Bank, and the World Health Organization, we start to think about good health, adequate nutrition, responsive caregiving, security and safety, and opportunities for early learning as all of the components of nurturing care that children really need in those earliest years to thrive later on. For the purposes of today and based on my expertise, we're going to continue talking just about the opportunities for early learning and responsive caregiving because I think those are the pieces we want to focus on today. Not that they are more important necessarily than any of the other components, but that's really what I want to highlight today. And at the core of this really is this idea that relationships matter, and there's a lot of evidence for this. So on one level, for example, we know that newborn infants recognize their birth parents' language already. so if we think about the relationships and how relationships are formed early in life, we know that children, even hours after birth, are able to recognize their birth parents' language and prioritize it over other languages that they have not been exposed to. Now, we know that this happens because, when children are in the womb, they're able to hear, beginning in that third trimester, they're able to hear mom's language as it's passed through the vibrations of the bone in her body to the baby in the womb. And they're able to understand things like the cadence. They're able to recognize a rhythm of a nursery rhyme if you sing that a lot during pregnancy. So when we're thinking about the quality of relationships, it really doesn't even begin on day one. It begins before day one, because that's when parents and children are beginning to bond. And that's going to have lots of policy implications that we can talk about in a few minutes. But these relationships are very important, and we're starting to get even more evidence, particularly brain-based evidence, that relationships do in fact build the brain. So here we have some data from an MEG, the magnetoencephalography machine, where we took children in the first 6 months of life, and we wanted to see how the sense of touch was represented in the child's brain. Now, interestingly, if we touch a child's hand or touch a child's foot, we actually see corresponding activation in the hand areas and foot areas of the brain. You might not know that you had a hand area and a foot area of your brain, but you do. And so we found that we saw activation exactly where we might have expected. So you touch an infant's hand, you see activation in the hand area of the brain. You touch an infant's foot, and you see activation in the foot area of the brain. Now, interestingly, some newer research that we have done has also suggested that if a child sees an adult's hand being touched, the child's hand area will also activate. In the same way that if a child sees an adult's foot being touched, the child's foot area of the brain will also activate. We're starting to think of this as almost like the roots of empathy, in the sense that a child has to be able to understand, if I watch your hand being touched, what would it feel like for my hand to be touched? This is a very, very profound kind of skill that we're thinking actually might begin very, very early in infancy. But again, as you think about what are some of those first things that caregivers like to do with baby in the hospital when they bring them home, you snuggle. There's a lot of skin-to-skin contact, and it turns out that touch is incredibly important, because it is those relationships, in fact, that do build the brain. Now, we start to see, as much as we're seeing the power of relationships early on, we know that continues throughout children's earliest years. The power of social relationships is profound later on. We know that children can communicate with people who are known and loved to them and important in their lives. They can communicate even, via video chat, for example, and children both recognize familiar people on video chat. They learn things from them. From a social emotional standpoint, they can use a known person on the other end of a video chat to be their secure base from a very classical attachment kind of perspective. They rely on this person. So even if that person's not in the room, the power of those social interactions can even transcend the distance of a video chat, for example. And so you really see that power of relationships, the power of social interactions continue through. And even as we get into early school years, and when children are 5 and 6, you again see the power of social interactions. Here, though, not as much between adults and children, but also between children themselves. And so it's not just that we're fostering, and we certainly are fostering the relationship between children and their caregivers, but it's also important to give children, as they grow older, that peer group that can be a support system as well and provide a lot of those rich social interactions. And so here, this is some research showing that when children are given a team, even if it's a virtual team that they've never met before, so this girl is part of Team Green, and she's doing some math problems that might be really hard for her otherwise. But because she's part of the team of Team Green, and Team Green does math problems and they like math, we know that that's going to boost her motivation. It's going to prolong her focus, raise her scores, increase her confidence. So this power of social interactions, the power of relationships, again, you really see that from birth and continuing into those school age years. And so how then do we prioritize the importance of these relationships from a policy standpoint, but also just, really thinking practically about what do caregivers and children need? Well, if we think about this and we really want to boil it down, I would suggest that children thrive when their basic needs are met and when they are in the context of relationships with caring and responsive adults. And so I hope that's what we've shown up until now. But now I want to kind of flip it and think about parents and what do parents need? Well, we know that parents are best able to support their children when the parents' basic needs are met, when they have time to engage with their child, and when their stress level is low or manageable. Now, I think this actually leads to a lot of policy recommendations because we can do things from a policy standpoint that create these conditions that allow parents to support their children. And it doesn't have to be, birth parents. This is caregivers broadly speaking. So how do we support caregivers who are supporting children? Well, one of these things that we mentioned here is stress. Now, we know that stress affects both parents and parents' ability to parent, and it also affects children. And so I want to think quickly about just reviewing these kinds of stress. So typically speaking, we think of stress as fitting into one of three categories. The first category of stress is toxic stress. Now, this is the kind of stress that is severe stress, neglect, abuse, death in family, things like that. So a very severe kind of stressor that happens over time, and the key is that it happens in the absence of a reliable and consistent relationship for the child. So if we're thinking about stress from a child's perspective. So if a child experiences abuse or neglect, it's prolonged over time, and they don't have that safe and responsive caregiver to help them buffer that stress is going to be toxic. Now, interestingly, if we think about what tolerable stress is, tolerable stress can often be the exact same stressor that might be classified as toxic, but in this case, the tolerable stress is moderated and mitigated because the child has a safe and responsive caregiver that can really start to buffer that stress. So it's somebody that the child can turn to, it's somebody that can help the child, get the appropriate services that they need, that they can, the child has somebody to talk to. The child has that outlet, that reliable and consistent caregiver. It does not have to be the parent. It can be any person in that child's life that the child finds to be, their safe person, if you will. Now, the third kind of stress is positive stress. And so positive stress are the kinds of stressors that are typically mild stressors. They are relatively short-lived, and they oftentimes even, make you better for it. So maybe the anxiety you have before you take a test, the anxiety that you might have before you, engage in public speaking, for example, all of these might be classified as positive types of stressors. They're short, they're relatively mild, and, oftentimes, you've done a good thing by getting through that stressor. So as we start to think about these types of stress and their effect on children's ability to thrive and parents' ability to support their children, I just want to consider that for either children or parents, staying in an environment of toxic stress is bad for your system. It's bad for your brain development in the sense that you can think about that as just, constantly revving your car's engine. It's going to deplete the engine over time. It's going to really wear and tear on that in the same way that stress does to our systems. Now, if we really want to go into stress, there's, a whole other, literature that we could consider. And perhaps that's, webinar 2.0 for Allison and Jenny to consider. But simply to say that the more we can mitigate stress and reduce stressors on children and parents, the more likely it is that they are going to thrive over time. And so at the end of the day, then, connection is key. We're thinking about connections between other people and the connections that children have that both allow them to mitigate the stressors and moderate the stressors in their life, but also to really thrive. Everything that we know of in terms of children's ability to learn over time is really based in relationships. And so it's not so much the toys that children have or the particular stuff that they have, it's really those relationships and the high quality engagements that occur in their everyday life. And that means, in an early learning setting, for example, we're going to prioritize a teacher's ability to engage children in these high quality interactions. Oftentimes that means a teacher might need professional development to do that. So we're thinking about high quality interactions that are based in relationships across the settings in which children are in throughout the day. And when we think about where children are throughout the day, I think it's important to consider that as much as we want to support children's formal learning opportunities, in the grand scheme of things, children are in informal learning opportunities far more than they are in formal learning environments. So formal learning environments, during those K-12 years, take up about 18.5 of your waking hours. It's much less, of course, in the 0 to 5 space, and much less as we get older. But at no point in time is a formal learning environment the predominant environment that children and families are in. And so I think it's important, as much as we want to support formal learning environments, and I think that's absolutely critical, but I also think we want to think about supporting those informal learning environments in the other places where children and families are. So if we think about exactly what that is, we might think about, those caregiving environments. So, is it the case that children have access to care, they have access to high quality care? What are the schools like? Are there sufficient schools? Are there enough slots in child care, for example? Are we providing families and children with the opportunity to be placed in some sort of formal care arrangement that allows parents to work and earn a living wage? What's the affordability of home costs, for example? We might consider parents' ability to make a living wage. You might consider a lot of, a host of other public services like libraries, the available resources that parents and caregivers have to access in the community. And, even things such as transportation systems. So, how easy it is it if a parent or caregiver is using public transportation, how easy is it for that parent to get the child to their formal care environment, and then for the caregiver to get to work and then back again at the end of the day? And how many languages does our community speak, and how many languages do we need to be providing resources in? I think that's another critical piece of this experience that we need to consider for families, and really thinking about serving families and meeting their needs. And so as we start to think about, where children are, I would encourage us to think more broadly than simply the family unit and simply the informal or formal learning environment. We want to think about the environment broadly speaking, and the communities that children and families are in. So how do we support that to really provide children with all of those good, high-quality early experiences that they're going to need to make them school ready? And so this is, of course, just a snapshot of what those choices might be, but you might consider things, in addition to, offering, high-quality professional development opportunities for teachers and early learning providers. You might also consider things like, are there enough slots, and what do we need to do to incentivize infant and toddler care, for example? Because all of the research really does show us that some of these most fundamental skills really begin in those first years of life. And so as much as I love the national movement to really think about preschool, I ultimately think that that's not early enough. And so how do we really start to go into that 0 to 3 space to provide those high quality opportunities for children? Because at the end of the day, we're thinking not just about, getting children ready for school in terms of, learning their numbers and ABCs and things like that. We're thinking about a new set of skills that the next generation of children might need. And, here we're thinking about skills that involve a lot of those higher cognitive skills that we talked about at the very beginning of this webinar. And so it's skills like taking turns and seeking help, the ability to solve problems, the ability to lead and follow and play, to self-regulate, to control impulses, to explore the environment. How do you understand routines? Are you aware of your emotions? Do you shift attention well? To me, those are the kinds of things that are going to make our next generation of children school ready. And it's a big departure, and I recognize that from, our former focus on, making sure that children can tie their shoes and that they can, know their ABCs, they know their numbers and their shapes. And I understand that because I think that it's more the skills rather than the absolute knowledge that really is going to grow that next generation. And when we think about what kinds of earliest experiences grow these skills that I'm talking about here, again, the answer is relationships. So if you think about high quality environments that allow children to play and to engage, and you could imagine a tea party between a young child and caregiver that allows the child to solve problems of what happens when the muffin falls on the floor, or what happens if we run out of tea. They're solving problems, they're playing, they're self-regulating if it's not their turn yet. You can start to see all of these skills really being embedded in a lot of those high-quality environments that we might imagine for children and families. So with that, we will close. I wanted to point you also to some resources that we have online. We have a series of online modules that are available for free that really take a much deeper dive into different areas of science we only touched on today. So we, of course, have a module on early brain development. We also have information on, a lot of information on language development, cognitive development, other forms of social and emotional development. So I'd encourage you to check those out if you're interested. And with that, we will close, and I know we have some time for questions.
Thank you, Sarah. I really enjoyed your presentation. I always learn something new. Thank you so much. If at this time, if you have any questions, please do type them into the chat box on the lower left side of your screen. We'll have some time. I will kick us off. I really loved your slide, Sarah, with the photo of the family in the middle and then sort of all the different choices you listed around them, showing different ways that we support families and their young children. Of course, we know that legislators have to make tough choices when it comes to budgets and prioritizing appropriations for all those different services and programs. So I'm curious to know, with your extensive knowledge of early childhood development, if you were a legislator, how would you go about prioritizing those programs or policies or services, those different supports you showed, in order to have the greatest impact on early learners?
Sure, it's a great question. And, I think that one of the things that we are seeing is that, infants and toddlers, especially in those early years, so infants and toddlers and their families need a lot of support. I always, there's such great data coming out of the home visiting literature in particular, in the sense that home visits, I think, and you can go for a variety of programs there, but I think home visits at their core are an opportunity for new parents in particular to really learn a little bit about child development, a little bit about, health and safety, a lot of those components of what the, World Health Organization and UNICEF and the other, the third organization, what was it? The World Bank. So, the home visit really, I think, allows a family to learn about all of those components in a way that is very timely. It oftentimes comes in those first few, weeks and months of life when parents are really just trying to figure things out. And there's such great data in terms of the effectiveness and how that really creates environments in which caregivers can support children's, early relationships, which we know are the basis for everything else. So I always think that home visiting programs do a lot of what we've talked about today, which I think is great. But I think that as legislators are thinking about, how to allocate these very precious dollars, and I completely sympathize with that, I think that, whatever the decision is, whatever that decision point is, asking yourself, what do families need, and how can this particular decision point support families, or does it support families? And then, really framing it from that way, because I do think that things as, relatively unrelated to children and families as transportation are actually important for families because they play into that, very functional thing. And so if you consider, that the breakdown that I showed of, what a child needs to thrive and what parents need to be able to support children, one of the things that parents need is time. And so to the extent that we can give parents and caregivers additional time, that's great. And the other thing that I would say too is that, these early learning environments, so for working parents, they absolutely need high quality care. And I think high quality care is something that, particularly for infants and toddlers, is something that we just don't have enough of in the country as a whole. And so I think the more that we can build policies that both incentivize choosing to offer infant and child care, perhaps as opposed to preschool or something to that effect, choosing to offer infant and toddler care, any way that we can incentivize that, any way that we can really support those early learning providers, both with professional development opportunities, with living wages for their own important work that they're doing. All of those things, I think, go into creating that high quality environment for infants and toddlers and their families.
Thank you so much. Well, seeing that there are no other questions at this time, I'm going to let everyone get on with their morning. It looks like we're about out of time here, so I'll finish by saying thank you so much to you, Sarah, to our partners at the Virginia Early Childhood Foundation, and to all of you for joining us this morning. Remember that we will share an archived copy of today's webinar in the coming days. If you have any remaining questions, please feel free to connect with us, connect with me, as my other ECE colleagues, with Sarah. As you prepare for the upcoming session, please keep in mind that NCSL is here for you. We would be happy to provide you with additional research, resources, or any follow-up information that may be helpful to you in the work you do in your state to support early learners. So we hope to hear from you. Thank you so much again, Sarah, and everyone enjoy the rest of your day.